In this episode, we focus on something many new learners underestimate until they sit in front of exam-style questions and feel their confidence start to wobble. They assume the hardest part will be remembering terms, but a big part of success actually comes from holding a steady pace and making clear decisions even when the question seems unfamiliar or slightly slippery. That matters because beginner-level security exams are not only checking whether you have seen a word before, they are also checking whether you can stay calm, read carefully, notice what matters most, and choose the answer that best matches sound security reasoning. A spoken learning path helps here because it can train your thinking rhythm, not just your memory. Once your pacing becomes steady and your decision habits become reliable, the questions stop feeling like random traps and start feeling more like situations you know how to sort through one step at a time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Pacing is often misunderstood as speed, and that misunderstanding causes trouble very early. A student hears that there is a time limit and immediately decides the goal is to move fast. But fast thinking and effective thinking are not the same thing. Good pacing is really about rhythm, because rhythm helps you avoid two bad extremes at once. One extreme is rushing through the question so quickly that you miss the exact thing being asked, and the other extreme is getting stuck so long that one difficult question starts stealing time and confidence from everything that follows. A steady learner works somewhere in the middle. That learner gives each question enough attention to understand its purpose, but not so much attention that the question becomes a personal battle. This is important for beginners because the brain tends to slow down when it feels uncertain, and that slowdown can quietly become a habit unless you train yourself to keep moving with control. Adaptive question thinking begins with accepting that not every question will feel the same, and that is normal rather than alarming. Some questions look clear right away, while others seem simple at first, and then reveal a hidden distinction that makes the decision harder. Some questions depend on direct understanding of a concept, while others depend on recognizing which answer is the most responsible, most secure, or most appropriate in a basic work situation. A student who expects every question to arrive in the same friendly format can get thrown off when the pattern shifts. A stronger student expects that shift and adjusts without panic. That is what adaptive thinking means in a beginner-friendly sense. It means your approach changes to match what the question needs. Instead of forcing every question into the same mental box, you learn to notice the kind of thinking required and respond with the right amount of care, comparison, and judgment. One of the most useful decision habits is learning to identify the real task of the question before your eyes settle on the answer choices. Many students rush to the options because they want relief as quickly as possible, but that can backfire because the options begin shaping their thinking before they have even understood the problem. A better habit is to listen for the decision being requested. Is the question asking you to recognize a concept, compare two ideas, identify the safest action, or choose the control that best fits the situation? When you know the task, the question becomes smaller and more manageable. Without that step, the mind tends to wander, and every answer choice starts looking strangely possible. This habit is especially helpful in security because small wording differences matter. A question about what is most effective is not the same as a question about what is most appropriate, and a question about reducing risk is not always the same as a question about removing it completely. Another steadying habit is learning to notice the center of the question rather than getting distracted by its surface details. Security questions often include background information, role context, or scenario language that makes the item feel more realistic, but not every piece of information carries equal weight. Beginners sometimes treat all details as equally important and then feel buried under too much text. The stronger move is to ask what the question is really pointing toward. Is the core issue identity, confidentiality, policy, continuity, human behavior, or risk reduction? Once you identify that center, the rest of the sentence becomes easier to sort. Some details help confirm the topic, while others are mainly there to create realism or mild distraction. This does not mean you ignore the context. It means you stop letting the context overpower the main decision. When learners build this habit, they begin to feel less intimidated by longer questions because they know how to separate the heart of the issue from the extra language around it. A related habit is learning how to hold uncertainty without freezing. New students often believe they must feel fully certain before they can answer, but many good decisions are made through structured reasoning rather than instant certainty. If two answer choices look close, that does not mean the question is unfair. It usually means the exam wants you to distinguish between an answer that is partly correct and an answer that is better aligned with foundational security judgment. In those moments, the goal is not emotional comfort. The goal is disciplined comparison. Ask yourself which choice best fits the role, the principle, or the risk described in the question. Ask which choice solves the actual problem rather than sounding technical or impressive. This mindset changes the experience of difficult questions. Instead of hearing uncertainty as a warning sign that you are failing, you start hearing it as part of the normal thinking process, and that keeps your pace from collapsing every time the question becomes slightly more demanding. Elimination is another decision habit that deserves more respect than it usually gets. Some learners think elimination is only for guessing, but it is actually a very disciplined form of reasoning that can sharpen your judgment even when you know the topic fairly well. In security questions, one answer is sometimes clearly wrong because it ignores the principle at the center of the scenario, creates unnecessary risk, or confuses a related concept with the correct one. Removing that option narrows the field and gives your brain a cleaner comparison. Then another option may look appealing at first, but reveal itself as too broad, too narrow, too late in the process, or too technical for the question being asked. By the time you have done that work, the best answer often becomes much easier to see. This matters for pacing because elimination prevents endless staring. It turns a vague feeling of being stuck into an active process, and active thinking is usually faster and more productive than anxious hesitation. Steady pacing also depends on understanding that time is a shared resource across the entire exam, not a prize to spend all at once on whatever question happens to bother you. Beginners sometimes become attached to a difficult question because they feel they should be able to solve it if they just stay a little longer. The trouble is that a few extra seconds can quietly turn into a long stretch of lost time and mental fatigue. A more mature approach is to treat each question as part of a longer journey. Some items will deserve a bit more attention, and some will be answered more quickly, but the overall rhythm should remain stable. When you overspend time early, you create pressure later, and pressure later often causes mistakes on questions you actually could have answered well. Good pacing protects future performance. It is not just about the current question. It is about preserving enough attention, calm, and time so that your best judgment remains available all the way through the exam rather than fading after a few early struggles. Emotional recovery is part of pacing too, even though many learners do not think of it that way. A hard question can leave a residue in the mind. And if that residue follows you into the next question, your pace becomes uneven and your decisions become less clear. This is why steady learners practice a kind of mental reset. Once a question is answered, they let it go and return their focus to the question in front of them. That sounds simple, but it is a real skill, especially for beginners who are still attaching emotion to every uncertain moment. Security judgment gets worse when the mind is carrying frustration, self-doubt, or a need to prove something on the next item. A better habit is to accept that some questions will feel imperfect and that no single moment decides the whole outcome. This emotional steadiness supports adaptive thinking because it allows your brain to meet each new question on its own terms rather than through the stress left behind by the previous one. As your decision habits improve, you also begin to notice that many exam questions are not asking for the deepest technical move. They are often asking for the most sensible foundational move. Beginners sometimes get pulled toward answers that sound advanced because advanced language feels authoritative. In reality, entry-level security thinking often rewards clarity, principle-based reasoning, and appropriate control selection over dramatic or highly specialized actions. That is why pacing and decision quality belong together. A rushed mind may grab the most technical-sounding choice without checking whether it actually fits the scenario. A steadier mind pauses long enough to ask whether the answer matches the level of the role, the goal of the control, and the likely responsibility of someone working from a foundational understanding of cybersecurity. This simple check can rescue learners from many avoidable mistakes. The best answer is not always the boldest or most complicated one. Very often it is the one that best reflects sound judgment, proportion, and a basic respect for risk and process. Pattern recognition becomes stronger when you practice this way, and that is one of the biggest long-term benefits of building decision habits early. At first, each question may feel unique and disconnected, but after repeated exposure, you begin to hear recurring patterns underneath the changing wording. You notice that some questions are really about choosing the preventive control over the reactive one, or the broader governance answer over the narrow technical answer, or the action that reduces risk most reasonably rather than pretending risk can disappear completely. This kind of recognition does not come from memorizing random facts. It comes from repeatedly slowing down just enough to identify what kind of judgment is being tested. Over time, that process becomes smoother and faster. Your pace improves not because you are hurrying more, but because your mind spends less energy reinventing its approach for every item. You begin to trust your method, and that trust makes it easier to stay balanced even when the wording tries to disguise a familiar security principle inside a new scenario. Audio-first learning can be especially useful for this topic because pacing and decision habits are partly about mental rhythm, and rhythm is easier to feel when ideas are heard in sequence. When you listen to strong explanations of question logic, you start to hear how concepts are contrasted, how safer answers are justified, and how weak answers are exposed without needing to see a screen full of text. This matters because some students believe thinking skills can only be built through heavy visual study, but much of security judgment is verbal reasoning. It involves hearing the problem clearly, holding the key idea in mind, and comparing possible choices against that idea. Repeated listening can strengthen that process by making your internal voice more organized. Instead of reacting chaotically to each new question, your mind starts sounding calmer and more structured. That inner structure supports better pacing because your thoughts are no longer bouncing around in every direction. They are moving through a practiced route that helps you read, narrow, compare, decide, and move on. Eventually, all of this comes together into a simple but powerful exam day posture. You read with intention, not panic. You look for the real task before falling into the answer choices. You identify the center of the scenario instead of getting buried in every detail. You tolerate uncertainty long enough to compare thoughtfully. You eliminate weak options with purpose. You protect your time because the whole exam matters more than winning a fight with one difficult question. You recover emotionally from imperfect moments and keep your attention available for what comes next. None of these habits requires advanced technical experience, and that should encourage new learners. These are trainable habits of mind, and they belong to anyone willing to practice steady thinking. Once they become familiar, the exam stops feeling like a blur of separate problems and starts feeling like a series of decisions that can be handled with a repeatable method. As we close, remember that strong pacing is not about racing the clock, and strong decision-making is not about feeling certain all the time. The real goal is to create a dependable thinking rhythm that helps you stay clear, practical, and calm as the questions shift in wording, difficulty, and demand. Adaptive question thinking means adjusting to the question in front of you without losing your overall method. That is why steady habits matter so much. They give you something reliable to return to when a question feels awkward or your confidence dips for a moment. Over time, these habits become part of how you think, not just how you test. That makes them valuable far beyond one certification, because the security field constantly rewards people who can slow down enough to understand what matters, move forward without freezing, and choose the answer that best reflects sound judgment under pressure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.